If you've been following me for a while, then you know that in recent years, I have been really getting into oil pastels. It has quickly become one of my favorite mediums to work with. So let's talk about some of the tips and tricks that I have learned along the way. This video is not sponsored by any of the companies mentioned. Hi, Shanna Rowe Jackson here, also known as Caution Artist at Play, because on this channel I play with all kinds of different art supplies. And today we are going to be talking about one of my favorites, oil pastels. I am going to be showing you a recent piece that I did using oil pastels and colored pencil. It's a winter scene. I know it's officially spring now, so this is kind of my last goodbye to winter, but I had a lot of fun with it. And it got me thinking about all the things I have learned since I started working with oil pastels, and I thought I would share some of those things with you. So we are going to talk about 5 tips or tricks or techniques that I like to use when I am working with oil pastels. These mainly pertain to the kind of style I like to work with, mainly realism, but I do think that they could be transferred to other styles as well. And this is not going to be a step-by-step tutorial. Like, I'm not going to be teaching you how to draw the drawing I did. I am just going to be talking about techniques that you can take back to your own work. So let's just jump into it. So this first tip may be the most important tip that I will be sharing with you in this video. And that is to choose the correct surface for your artwork. Now, choosing the right paper is important in any medium that you use. And let's be real, oil pastel can pretty much make marks on any kind of surface. It's just that kind of soft, obviously oily kind of texture that really makes it easy to write on different surfaces. However, if you are somebody who wants to do any amount of detailed work, or something a little bit more on the realistic side, and you want to be able to get a lot of layers and detail in, it is important that you choose a surface that can handle all those techniques. And for me, my favorite surface is the Luxe Archival Sanded Paper by Brush and Pencil. That's what I typically use. And in this piece, I am actually using the Clairefontaine Pastelmat. It's a mounted pastel mat. And it's basically like Pastelmat on a mat board. And it works really, really well for the techniques I'm trying to do. As you can see in this extreme close-up, it has like this lightly, almost sand-like texture. It's not quite as sandy as a regular sanded paper, but this is made to hold a lot of layers of pastel. And for me, that's very important because not only does it allow me to get the layers I need in pastel, it also allows me to work with other mediums on top of it as well, which we'll talk about in a little while. Now, that being said, I know that Luxe Archival paper and Pastelmat are a little bit on the pricey side. So there are more economical options that you can do if you don't have the money to invest in a really expensive sanded paper. And my friend Lindsay Wyrick, who you will probably know as the Frugal Crafter, she works with oil pastels a lot as well. And I have spoken with her about some of her favorite kinds of surfaces that she likes to use. And she is somebody who she really likes to take just scrap pieces of mat board. You can buy archival acid-free mat board at any framing shop or any kind of art material shop and use clear gesso to get that sand-like texture so that it will hold a lot of pastels. And she recommends using the Liquitex clear gesso. She says of the ones that she's tried, the Liquitex brand works best for that technique. Canson also has come out with a fairly inexpensive sanded paper. It's their Canson XL sand grain paper, and that works really well as well. Now, if you are not somebody who needs the amount of layering or detail, if you're not looking to do anything necessarily realistic, but you want to get more painterly with your pastels, and you want the evident kind of pastel mark making and an impasto look, then you may not necessarily need to use a sanded paper. As I mentioned, oil pastels are really versatile on the type of surface they will go on. It really just comes down to what you need to do for techniques and the end result you're looking for. So if you're going for something a little bit more impressionistic, a smooth surface may not be a big deal, because if you're just going in and not planning on mixing too much and you want to have these fun, expressive kind of marks on your paper, then you could get away with using a smoother surface if you needed to. I know a lot of artists who like to use Bristol board. It's really going to come down to personal preference. So as with anything else, I recommend that you try different surfaces with the pastels you have. And I have to be honest, you can get away with making some really, really great artwork with very inexpensive pastels. But the surface will always affect the final result in one way or another. And it's also going to determine the enjoyability of creating an artwork. So I recommend trying out different surfaces, different scrap pieces of paper to see what works for you with your pastels and with your techniques. But for me personally, in the style that I work in, I prefer a sanded kind of surface. Also, another surface that I think works really well with oil pastels is the ampersand pastel board that has a nice kind of pastel texture surface to it that is made to hold a lot of layers of pastel. And a lot of these surfaces work great for soft pastel as well. And the pastel board is archival and it's a panel, and so it kind of gives it that nice solid finished feeling to it. That can be a little bit on the pricier side as well. So as with anything, do what you can within your means, play around and experiment and see what surface works for you. Because I do think that if you have been struggling with pastels or with oil pastels, it may not be the pastels themselves. It could very well be the type of surface that you have been using with them. Okay, so the next tip involves blending. Now, oil pastel never fully completely hardens and dries, and so it makes it really nice to blend and mix colors directly on the paper. And there are numerous ways that you can blend them. Now, you're going to have some oil pastels that are a little softer, and you're going to have some oil pastels that are a little harder. So, depending on what kind of oil pastel you are using, that can determine what tool you're going to use to blend them with. But generally speaking, most oil pastels can be blended really easily just with regular blending stumps or even using your hands. A lot of times I will wear gloves when I'm working with oil pastels so that I can use my gloved hand to blend things with my fingers and not worry about getting my own oils on them. I didn't with this one because I was using other tools. But this is something else that you might want to play around with on scrap paper. Now, I have a bunch of different blending tools that I'm using here. Most of them are things like soft tools, which are, it's spelled S-O-F-F-T. It's an actual brand. They are used quite often for pan pastels. But you'll see me using some soft tools here, along with some other kind of generic makeup applicators that I use to blend things out. I personally really like applicators for eyeshadow. They work really well, especially, again, on a sanded surface. Some of this is also going to depend, again, on your surface. I find on a sanded surface, I'm able to blend things really, really easily because the sanded texture on the other side of my pastel kind of acts almost like a lubricant where it's blending from the other side because you're getting that friction between the sanded texture and your blending implement. So it's kind of blending from both sides. I have never had really any issues blending on a nice sanded surface. And so I am using the soft tools. I'm using them gently just to push the pigment around. There are times where I want to have a little bit of a different kind of blend to it. And that's when you're going to pull out either the silicone or the rubber kind of tools. These are often used for sculpting, but they work really well for pushing pigment around on the paper. I find that those work great for creating edges. And if you are somebody who doesn't have access to one of those tools, I find that rubber erasers actually work pretty well, especially when you have multiple layers of pastel down. You can use a standard white rubber eraser to blend some things out. And I also have one of the Faber-Castell Perfection erasers. It's the pink one. That one's really rubbery. I don't use the white one for that because that one will really actually help you erase. The pink one, though, is nice and soft. It's a nice, soft, rubbery feeling. That helps to blend things out as well in lieu of having actual silicone or rubber kind of tools and brushes. Some people also like to use different mediums, such as odorless mineral spirits, to blend out their pastels as well. You can use things like rubbing alcohol or lavender spike oil or a citrus solvent. There are a lot of different kinds of solvents that you can use that will blend out your oil pastels. I typically don't go that route because, as I mentioned before, with the techniques that I use, I am able to blend just fine without any solvents. But if you are in a pinch and you're having a hard time getting your pastels to blend, that is something that you may want to look into. Something else that I mentioned a little bit ago, just briefly, that I think we need to take a closer look at is how hard or soft the pastels you have are. Some oil pastels are on the harder side and some are on the softer side. And just like with any other medium, such as colored pencil, if something is on the softer side, it is going to be much easier to blend than if it's on the harder side. So softer oil pastels do tend to be best when you are looking to really blend. However, pastels that are on the harder side of things are great if you are looking to get a harder edge on something or have a line that you want to keep in place and some added details as well. I am using the Van Gogh oil pastels. These are my go-to pastels, especially for the techniques that I use. I find I have no trouble blending them out on the types of papers that I prefer, and I'm able to layer easily over them for detail. However, there are other pastels on the market that are much harder and much softer than the pastels I have. So for instance, if you want to go for something really soft, you might want to try out some of the Paul Rubens oil pastels. Those tend to be on the soft and buttery side, I find. And if you want something really, really ooey gooey and soft, then you're going to go for something like the Sennelier oil pastels. Those puppies, boy, let me tell you, they might as well be lipstick. Like, you are getting a stick of butter when you're working with those. Those blend out beautifully as well. And for an oil pastel that's on the harder side of things, I do find that the Koh-i-Noor oil pastels are a little bit more on the stiffer side of things. So if that's something that you're looking for detail, you might want to look into those. And of course, there are thousands of different kinds of oil pastels out there. And as I mentioned before, you can get a lot done with a fairly inexpensive oil pastel as well. So just play around with different pastels within your budget to see what works for you. Now, my next tip deals with layering. So we've talked about blending. Let's talk a little bit about layering. Now, I find that layering also depends very, very heavily, again, on the type of surface you use. And my sanded paper obviously helps me get a lot of layers with oil pastel. Oil pastels can lay down pretty thick, so they can fill the tooth of the paper pretty fast. Now, I have found a few different ways to combat that and some techniques that I like to use when I am working. And one of those main techniques is to let things set a little bit. So for instance, with this snow, I came in and layered my white down and I let it set a little bit before I came in to work with layers over the top of it. And what I mean by that is just kind of letting it stiffen up a little bit. Unlike paint, oil pastels never fully dry. However, their binders can stiffen up over time, just a little bit. Now, for instance, I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but if you don't use your oil pastels or even sometimes certain kinds of colored pencils will do this. If you haven't used them for a little while, they might stiffen up and get a little bit of a film over them. And when that happens, it can make it a little bit more difficult to use them. And again, this kind of goes in line with what I was talking about with blending. If you haven't used your oil pastels in a while and you go to make some marks and it's not laying down very well, maybe just wipe it down with a little bit of a paper towel, because the oil pastels will get a little bit of a film over them, which causes them to harden up over time. But once you take that layer off, you can work with them again. Now, we can use this to our advantage when it comes to layering pastels. And it doesn't really take that long when you are just layering it on the paper, because obviously the layers on the paper aren't as thick as the pastel we have in our hand. And so I use that to my advantage in this piece. I often work in sessions when it comes to my art because I am working with a lot of different kinds of detail. So I'll come in and work for an hour or two and then walk away for a while and come back to it. And I did that a lot with this, and I found that helped a lot with layering. So when I came in and I laid down my initial layers for the snow, I found that it was much easier to layer over them when I gave it some time to set up and kind of harden a little bit and come back to it later to do my other layers than it did when I was working all in one session. Because oil pastels mix really easily on the surface, if you don't give it that time to set up, sometimes it can just make it so you're blending with the layers below. However, if you give it a little bit more time, and it really doesn't take that long, maybe an hour or two to just kind of stiffen up a little bit, it does make it a little bit easier to come in and create more layers. Now, that being said, No matter if you are doing your artwork in one session or if you're spreading it out over multiple sessions, it is a good rule of thumb to work thin to thick. So your bottom layers should have thinner layers of pastel that you have blended out into the surface a little bit more. And then you come over top with subsequently thicker layers, and that helps as well. Now, the next tip that I have is in line with layering, and that is do not be afraid to use other materials with your oil pastels. As you have seen throughout this entire piece that I've been working on, I am using colored pencils with my oil pastels. This is one of my favorite ways to work with oil pastels. I often come in and lay down my oil pastels first and use my colored pencils for details. Now, if you are somebody who works larger than I do, you may not need to bring in colored pencils. I'm only working on an 8x10, so it's a little bit more difficult to get that high detail that I need with the pastels alone. But if I were to be working larger and didn't need to have my details to be quite so small, then I could probably get the same exact amount of detail with just the pastels because I would have more space to have those broader pastel strokes. However, I work small and I do a lot of fine detail on very small surfaces. So for me, it makes sense to bring in colored pencils, which can be sharpened to a point to create my detail. And this is often how you're going to see me work with pastels on this channel. I'm somebody who I like to work with multiple different kinds of materials. You know this about me. And I had a vision in mind for this painting, and I knew that colored pencil would help me create that vision. And so I brought it in. And I have to tell you, working this way also speeds things up. I come from a colored pencil background, and I was working with colored pencils for years before I started to fall in love with oil pastel. And I have to tell you, working with them together really kind of changed the game for me, because this piece was able to be done in about half the time that it would have been had I worked with colored pencil alone. This took around 5 hours. It could have easily taken 10 or more with just colored pencil. I prefer to work with usually oil-based pencils when it comes to working on sanded paper. So you're going to see me use a lot of the Caran d'Ache Pablos and Polychromos on here. However, for certain areas where I am using the pencil to create the actual tone of something instead of just the fine details, you're going to see me come in with some softer pencils like my Derwent drawing pencils. And I have some Holbein in here as well, and they all work beautifully for this technique. The sanded paper allows for me to grip on top of the oil pastel with colored pencil. I don't believe I would be able to get these techniques the same way using colored pencil over oil pastel if I were to do it on a smooth paper. In fact, I know personally for me, I wouldn't be able to because I've tried. I mean, it will work because the pencil scrapes through the layers of pastel. I'm just not a fan of the way it looks. And honestly, I'm not a fan of the way it feels when I'm working that way. It just feels too slick. And I don't feel like I'm able to get the saturation and amount of layers that I'm looking for. This is the main reason why I like to work on a sanded paper. Now, you're also seeing me bring in a little bit of pan pastel to create an underpainting as well. And that was where I wanted kind of a softer underpainting to create just some tones of color. And that works well as well, especially if you only have a certain amount of colors in your oil pastels, or if you don't want to have thick layers of pastel. I knew I was going to have a lot of different detail in this spot with these leaves, and that I would need to use my colored pencil. And while I am able to get a lot of layers of colored pencil over oil pastel on this paper to begin with, it is much easier to do it if I have a thinner layer of pastel. So using the pan pastel allowed me to have just a light layer of pastel for color so that I could come in with those finer details. And then you'll see me work it up even more with my oil pastels and pencils as I go. Again, layering until I get the amount of saturation and detail that I like. So if you are somebody who likes to work on smaller surfaces and you are having trouble getting the detail that you need with oil pastels, or if for some reason you just want thinner underlayers or wanted to tone your surface, say you are working on a white sanded paper and you want to be able to tone your surface before using your oil pastels, I suggest bringing in other materials like pan pastels for an underlayer or colored pencil for specific details. Okay, so now that we have all our layers and blending and details down, let's talk a little bit about other fun special effects that you can get. Now, it can be kind of difficult to correct oil pastel. As I mentioned before, I use erasers for blending. So it's not necessarily easy to erase oil pastel, and especially on a sanded surface, it doesn't allow for a whole lot of erasing. However, there are ways that you can correct, and one of my favorite ways to do that is to use a craft knife to scrape away different layers. And you're going to see me come in and use this technique to create some details in the leaves as well. And it's basically where you are going to be scraping layers of the pastel away. I use a slice craft knife. It's got a ceramic blade, so I'm not as worried about cutting myself. You can use an X-Acto knife. You just got to be very gentle with it. You want to make sure you're not scraping too deep because you don't want to damage your paper and you don't want to scrape off any of the gesso or the texture of your paper. You want to be able to just make sure you're scraping certain layers of the pastel so that you can get the effect that you're looking for. And that's one of the wonderful things about pastel. Again, going back to the layering, you can scrape things away. Here I am with that craft knife, and you can see I'm just lightening up some details in those leaves. I am scratching out places that I got a little too dark and correcting different shapes with it. This is not something that you have to just use for realism or for correction. If you are somebody who likes to do surrealism and you like to do really colorful works, I know that Black Bean CMS, another fantastic pastel artist, uses the Scraffito technique in almost every single art piece as a way to create emphasis and texture. And this can be done on a smoother surface as well. If you watch Black Bean's content, then you will know there's a lot more smoother surfaces being used in that content than mine. And it's a great way to create some scratch board effects in your artwork. You can layer contrasting colors on top of one another and scrape things away to reveal the colors below. There's all kinds of different ways that you could use this as different techniques in your art, even if you're not a realism artist. And it's a lot of fun. And there are other tools like stylus pens and, different types of tools that you can use. You don't have to use a craft knife. You could use various kinds of tools to get those effects. And it's just something that adds a little bit of pizzazz. And something else that I think that you should consider when doing any kind of artwork is also, again, I'm going back to the surface. No matter what surface you're working on, it's to let the surface do the work for you. So in various areas, you're seeing, like in my rocks, for instance, I did not blend everything out completely. I left the texture of the paper showing. And even if you're working on a smoother paper, there are ways of doing that with the texture of the pastel itself. You don't have to blend everything. You want to pay attention to your hard lines, your soft lines, the different textures in your paintings, and allow the unique qualities of your pastels, your pencils, and your surface to do the work for you. So those are some of the things that I have learned since I've started working with oil pastels, and just a few things that have helped me in my style when I work with this medium. Okay, folks, I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you learned a little bit about how I like to work with oil pastels. If you have any fun techniques that you like to use when working with this medium, please drop it in the comments below because I love to learn from other artists and I know the other viewers do too. Let's get a fun conversation going. Prints of this piece are available on my print site as different fun products, regular prints, greeting cards, tote bags, all kinds of fun stuff. So I will link that in the description below as well. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time. You have a fantastic day. Bye.